I'd like to give my take on the free rider problem as applies to defense and military spending. Uh, there's a couple issues. One is that there's an assumption here that defense services are all, confer external benefits. Now, not all of them do. It's not the case that every kind of defense appropriation or spending is going to benefit everybody. There are going to be some types that only benefit some people, and there's a couple examples here. One, if you have a defense firm, they can do something like build a bomb shelter or a storage, shelter for property, and that can be excludable. They can say, hey, if you pay us, you get a ticket to the bomb shelter if there's ever an attack. If you don't pay us, you don't get a ticket to the bomb shelter. That's a pretty easy thing for them to exclude people from. So, even if the defense firm is actually working to defend the city, if you are not paying them, then you have less security than you otherwise would. But this doesn't necessarily have to apply only to firms. You may very well say, hey, I don't need a gun, I don't need a bulletproof vest, I don't need any of that stuff because my neighbors do. But if it ever came down to it, you could very easily be in a situation where you might actually really want a gun. And so it makes sense for you not to just assume that, well, I won't need one because my neighbors will have one. I mean, it's true today with criminals. It's true, the empirical studies have shown that handgun ownership and gun ownership and people who carry guns reduce crime even for people who don't. But that doesn't mean that there is no reason to invest in a handgun yourself, because there's still the chance that you could get mugged. And the fact that that might happen means that it still makes sense for people to go and buy guns, and so people still do. I've never heard anybody say that, oh, I favor gun ownership and it's great, and it's so great that I actually don't need to buy a gun because there's a positive externality with other people owning guns, and that will keep me from being mugged. Never heard anybody say that, and people are going to do that. Now, I think the other thing is that a lot of this is based on the kind of a tendency to think that a market society needs to ape the state, and I don't think this is the case. The institution of defense currently, as run by the state, does not exist to provide its primary goal, its primary function, its primary design is not to provide security or defense to the masses. It is to serve the interests of the state, to protect the state, and to serve the state's needs, which are not the same as defense. There is sometimes an overlap, to be sure, but that's incidental. There is no, of course, legal requirement for them to actually protect you. When they formulate their plans on how they are going to use the military, they do not consider how are they going to protect every single person, every single town, every single bit of property. Their main focus is how are we going to protect the government? How is the president going to survive? How is the Congress going to survive? How are they going to maintain their control over the society at large? That's the big thing, because if they were ever to lose that, then they would have no other, that is their leg. That's the one thing, the pillar on which they are totally based. And so ultimately, their entire structure is based on the aggression against the property rights of the people they allegedly exist to protect. Now, the military as it exists now is mostly not defensive. Aircraft carriers, most aircraft actually, maybe all aircraft, most of the Navy, an enormous fraction of the spending, nuclear weapons, most of them anyway, ballistic missiles, a huge chunk of military spending, and I can't tell you what fraction because it is debatable. Is every single M16 necessary? Is every single, I don't know. But a large chunk of it is not. And there's no reason to conclude that, well, we would have to find a way to voluntarily fund a fleet of aircraft carriers in a free society, and if we don't, then that's a problem. No, we don't have any need for such things. I believe that, in general, defense I think there's been too much emphasis on defense firms. I believe that the provision of defense is going to be very much based on market incentives, and in most places, most of the time, a a defense firm doesn't make a lot of sense. If you live in a rural environment where attempting to defend everybody would be very difficult because it's over a wide area, and there aren't that many people to begin with, it is very unlikely that there would be any defense firms, and people would just organize themselves either as individuals or as militias as they saw fit. Now, if they lived in an area where there was very little chance that there would be any kind of aggression against them, as is the case in almost all areas of the United States, then it is likely that they will not do very much in terms of defense. And I don't see how that would be a problem. Why should people who live on an island in Lake Michigan, that has no strategic value to anybody, that's thousands of miles from any potential battle, why should they be spending money on aircraft carriers and fighter jets? It doesn't make any sense. On the other side, if there are big urban centers, perhaps on the coast, that might be worried about pirates or brigands or some other kind of roving bands. Look, that kind of stuff doesn't just materialize out of nothing. People usually have some idea whether there's a chance there's going to be warlordism nearby. And of course, in the city, there's more people, there's more money to be made, there's more profit. Then I think you would see some firms, and they would be competing, and some of them would say, hey, pay our firm, and then you can have access to our bomb shelter, you can have access to our secure storage facility, and we'll issue you a weapon or whatever, or train you. If you join our army, whatever, receive 2 weeks of training per year or whatever. When the time comes, you'll have a body of men and women with which to cooperate for your defense. And militias basically can do this. Right now, the United States has quite a few militias. Nobody knows exactly how many, and I'm sure we would have to say that they vary in their effectiveness considerably. Some of them are probably a little more than weekend warriors. Some of them are probably fairly effective at what they do. And the thing is we actually don't have any idea how many there are and how effective they are. And this poses enormous difficulties for anybody who would actually want to invade, because then there's no way to assess, how many. I mean, there are probably some big cities in the United States that would have almost zero resistance, and yet there are also some probably really tiny, dinky backwoods places that would probably raise hell. And there's no way to know this a priori how it's going to work out. And the other thing is if you were invaded, there would all of a sudden be way more impetus to these organizations, and they would become much, much more effective. So, the idea that if costs, if there's an external benefit that a good won't be provided is not the case. I mean, if this is true, then there would be no recording artists, because their music can be copied and be downloaded for free by anybody. So hence they won't be recording artists. No, because there's still a demand for their goods and services, so there's money to be made. There's always going to be a demand for defense. And now a lot of it may only manifest in gun ownership. And that's the other thing, is people will say, just a citizen owning a gun, that's not enough to fight an army. Well, A, it is enough to fight an army, because it's happened many times. B, in our current system, arms are limited. People are prevented from purchasing whatever they might wish to purchase, which, hamstrings them when it comes to what they, personally, I believe most of the weapons that we're allowed to own, the people learned how to use them would be extremely effective. However, it would be nice if there were no limits on ordnance, and if we didn't have a state, then there wouldn't be any limits on ordnance, and you would have people investing in them. And the other thing, if you look at something like a tank. I mean, the United States military, I think it has less than 5,000 tanks. It's probably a lot less than that. It might only be like 1,500. I'm not going to look up the numbers right now. There is good reason to think that there would be many times that many tanks in private hands. I think there actually are more tanks than that in private hands right now, and the government heavily restricts them, who can have them and what type. I think that if there were no laws on it, that many people would own them as hobbies, but some of them, as part of their hobby, would want them to actually be effective weapons. And they can be effective weapons, and they can be used by individuals. And if you doubt me, I would look up Marv Heemeyer and the Killdozer. This is a guy in Colorado who in 2004 built his own tank and took revenge on the city councilman who zoned his business out of business. And the government in that city, the police, were completely helpless to stop him. They came out with their M16s and their flashbangs, and they even used other bulldozers against him, and they were totally outclassed by this guy who got his revenge. And it's interesting because that was one guy. He did it all by himself. There's no reason to assume, without any restrictions, that more people couldn't own tanks. And anybody who invaded, most of the time they wouldn't encounter a tank, but every once in a while they'd, go to some town or some neighborhood, and lo and behold, there's a mechanic who lives in the neighborhood who has a tank, and his 6 buddies who have guns, and they could wipe out a squad or 2 or whatever. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but then you multiply that by 300 million people, and all of a sudden you have an occupation army that would need to be 30 million people. And there isn't a country in the world that can field that large an army, at least as an occupational army. So, you could say that a person who owns a tank would nobody would ever own a tank, because the fact that they own it, it's really expensive, and it will garner a benefit to others who haven't paid. That's true, but it garners the most benefit to the person who has paid. And so there's still an incentive to do it. Just like gun ownership, even though the other gun owners actually, benefit you, there's still an incentive to own a gun yourself, and there's still an incentive to form your own militia. You could very well say, hey, there are defense firms, but you know what? We're not in those defense firms, so they are not going to go out of their way to protect us. We might receive ancillary benefits, but they're not going to protect our house or our people. So we should organize ourselves into our own neighborhood militia. And let me tell you, just a couple guys, just a group of 4 or 5 guys who cooperate together can be extremely effective, especially if they're fighting on their home turf. And yeah, 4 or 5 guys is not going to defeat an army, but you have 4 or 5 guys in every neighborhood across the whole country, and all of a sudden it becomes completely impossible to conceive of conquest by violence. So it's not as much of an issue as people think, because there's still an increased benefit to the person who's actually controlling whatever the capital good or good that's used in defense, whether it be a tank or a missile or a bomb shelter or a submarine or whatever. So, think about it like this. Say New York City, which has millions of people, they probably have many defense firms. They might have some defense firms that operate little harbor craft or whatever, and who knows? They might have one that they might end up manning a nuclear submarine. And if you live in New Jersey, it's possible to say, hey, well, we don't have to worry. New York City has a nuclear submarine, and they'll retaliate against anybody who threatens us. But you also have to go think in the back of your mind, well, if we're not actually paying for that submarine, there's a chance that they might say, you know what, we're not going to spend our money on a missile to protect you. So there's still the idea, the possibility that it still might be good to have your own submarine, or at least something. I just use that as an example, to have something. And people, if there's a demand, and there's a way to provide the supply, there will be. And if there's not a lot of threat of being aggressed against, then yeah, the military spending is going to be a lot less, as it should be. And if there's ever a period where it looks like, hey, China's going to attack, or Mexico is full of warlords and they're going to attack, or the Canadians want to spread their socialist utopia through violence, there's no reason to assume that would just happen out of the blue. It's not like some science fiction where a dimensional portal opens and an army pours forth. That's never going to happen that way. It's always going to be, we have some idea that there might be some kind of violence, and people will prepare. People will go and buy guns. People will go and talk to their neighbors and organize. People will start defense firms. So, the free rider problem, I don't think it's even specific to defense. It's an issue with everything, but it's not that big of an issue, because as long as there's still a demand, there's still added benefit for whoever provides it for themselves.